The wind of winter 171 AD did not only bring cold from the Alps. It brought the memory of dishonor, the smoke of burned villages, the lament of violated provinces. The previous year had been not a defeat, but a nightmare. The Roman Empire, at the territorial apogee of its power, had seen the unthinkable. The great Danube River, that ideal and physical line between civilization and barbarism, had been crossed not by bands of marauders, but by entire nations in arms. Marcomanni, Quadi, Vandals, and then, further east, the iron storm of the Sarmatian knights Iazygi. They had broken through not in one point, but in a myriad of points, overwhelming the scattered defenses. They had spread into Pannonia, Rhaetia, and Noricum. And then, the supreme horror, the blow to the heart, they had crossed the Julian Alps. The news that the barbarians were under the walls of Aquileia, the rich gateway to Italy, had shaken Rome more than any earthquake. For the first time since Hannibal, an external enemy threatened the peninsula. Panic had gripped the eternal city. There was talk of ominous omens, of the wrath of the gods. The temple of Janus Gemino, whose doors were closed only in times of total peace, remained wide open, an iron warning to universal vulnerability. The emperor, Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, the philosopher on the throne, the sovereign whose meditations were already taking shape in his tent, had found himself having to manage not a border war, but an existential crisis. The imperial defensive system, that Limes considered inviolable, had revealed itself to be a dam full of leaks. The consequences of 170 were a geography of demise. Entire regions north of the Po had been plundered. The population had been killed or carried off into slavery in appalling numbers. Entire auxiliary units, isolated garrisons, perhaps even a legion, the Legio Uno Adiatrix seems to have suffered terrible losses, had been annihilated. The trade routes had been interrupted, the gold and salt mines of Noricum had fallen into enemy hands. The army, the backbone of the empire, was humiliated, disorganized, shattered into defeated groups. The barbarians, after the sack of Aquileia failed due to city resistance or perhaps due to internal discord, had retreated, but not beyond the Danube. They had settled, as an extirpated body, in Roman territories south of the great river, living on the land they had conquered. The Danube was no longer the frontier. It was a lost line of control, behind which the enemy had entrenched himself. Marcus Aurelius, in Rome, faced a storm of another nature. The Senate was restless. The people, scared. The treasury funds, drained by the Antonine plague which was still claiming victims and by the Parthian wars of Lucius Verus, his brother and co-emperor who had passed away a few years earlier. His Stoic philosophy, which taught the serene acceptance of fate, was put to the cruelest test. The destruction of the state that it was his duty to protect could not be accepted. In his private writings he may have questioned fate, but in his public edicts there was no trace of hesitation. It had to be the pillar. The first bitter lesson of 170 was clear. One could no longer think of a punitive war, of an expedition for loot or glory. This was a war of survival. A war to restore the cosmic order, the Pax Romana, which had been violated. Before winter tightened the operations in its icy grip, the emperor had ordered the first, desperate counterattacks. They weren't major strategic maneuvers, they were billhook blows to stop the bleeding. Generals whose names we do not know, perhaps the prefects of the Danube fleets or the commanders of the surviving garrisons, had gathered what remained, disbanded cohorts, surviving knights, local militias. They had engaged in small battles, besieged temporarily occupied villages, and tried to reconquer the river fords. It was a containment action, bloody and chaotic. But it served a vital purpose, to demonstrate that Rome was not dead, that it was still fighting, that imperial territory was no man's land. It was in this bath of blood and mud that the surviving army learned, at great cost, the enemy's new tactics, the lightning-fast mobility of the Sarmatian knights, armed with very long spears, contus, and a coat of shiny scales, the ferocity of the northern men who fought on foot with large shields and wore axes. When Marcus Aurelius closed the rolls of civil administration and prepared to leave Rome in early 171, he was not heading for war. He was heading towards a rubble construction site. The task was not to lead a victory, but to build the possibility of it. The year 170 had left a legacy of ash and fear. The year 171 would begin in that harsh winter, with the emperor traveling north, towards the Danube, towards Carnuntum. His mind was no longer just on the treatises of Epictetus, but on the registers of the granaries, on the lists of personnel, on the strength of the pontoon bridges. The philosopher had transformed himself, by necessity, into an organizer of desperation. What was at stake was no longer glory, but the restoration of a border, of an idea, of a world. And everything had to start again on the wrong side of the river. The Carnuntum where Marcus Aurelius established his praetorium in the winter of 171 was no ordinary frontier town. It had become the brain and beating heart of an organism in resuscitation. The legionary camp of the 14th Gemina, the stone fortress overlooking the great river, was buzzing with feverish, orderly but desperate activity. Here, in a room heated by braziers, among maps traced on deerskins and messengers covered in frost, the philosopher-emperor applied his inner discipline to the most concrete chaos, logistics. The Marcomannic war would not have been won only with swords, but with sacks of grain, planks of wood, and nails forged in series. The defeated army of 170 had to be rebuilt atom by atom, and the Danube, from a line of enemy penetration, had to be transformed into the backbone of the Roman offensive. The first huge challenge was new blood. The Danube legions, the first Adiatrix, the second Adiatrix, the Decio Gemina, the 14th Gemina, had been bled dry. The traditional recruitment basins in the Danube provinces, themselves devastated, were not enough. So, in an act of pragmatism that horrified the purist senators in Rome, Marcus Aurelius ordered extraordinary recruitments. And here occurred the gesture that summarizes the absolute emergency: the enlistment, in special units, of volunteer slaves and gladiators. It was a decision that resounded like thunder in Roman ideology. The slave, instrumentum vocal, speaking instrument, could not take the military oath, he had no virtus. But the emperor, looking at the map of empty provinces, chose the survival of the social body over the purity of his principles. These men, equipped at the expense of their owners or the imperial exchequer, would not have been sent to the front lines in traditional formations. But as numbers or vexallations, as irregular troops for garrison, escort or disturbance tasks, they freed the veteran legionaries for decisive operations. It was desperation transformed into a resource, a cynical and brilliant calculation. At the same time, the imperial machine set in motion to transfer forces from every pacified corner. Vexallations, detachments sometimes numbering 1,000 men, began an epic exodus northward. They arrived from Britain, from Spain, from the African coasts. Men who had looked at the mists of Hadrian's Wall or the waves of the Atlantic found themselves marching along the icy roads of Noricum, towards that front forgotten by the gods. The strength of the empire, its ability to move war professionals from one border to another like pawns on a continental chessboard, manifested itself in all its silent power. The army was becoming a mosaic, but every tile was made of hard stone. The real strategic genius, however, revealed itself in the revaluation of the Danube itself. The river was no longer an obstacle, but a highway. The fleets of Messino and Ravenna were legendary, but here, in the cold green waters of the Danube, the classis Pannonica and the classis Moesica operated, river fleets often forgotten by major history. Under the command of men like Marcus Valerius Maximian, prefect of the Pannonian fleet, the Liburnian and Byrrhene fleets became the secret weapon. They transported grain from the amphorae of Illyricum to the warehouses of Carnuntum. They moved entire cohorts from one sector to another in one day, rather than in a week's march. They provided platforms for siege engines or for coups on the banks controlled by the barbarians. Control of the river meant control of time and space. It meant that the Romans could concentrate forces in one point, strike, and disappear, while the barbarians, divided to the north, had to march on foot through forests and swamps. It was naval mobility applied to land warfare, and it was the force multiplier that turned the tide. While the barbarians, divided by the spoils and discord typical of coalitions, settled in winter quarters scattered across the occupied territories, perhaps believing that Rome was now finished, a precision instrument was forged in Carnuntum. It was no longer the arrogant army of 170, which had underestimated the enemy. It was a tougher, more heterogeneous organism, humbled by defeats and welded together by the iron will of its commander. Marcus Aurelius was not preparing a simple retaliatory campaign. He was building, piece by piece, a mechanism of reconquest and reaffirmation. The winter on the Danube was not a period of respite. It was the rustle of a spring being wound, the dull noise of iron being tempered. Spring would be the hammer blow. Around Marcus Aurelius, in that iron winter in Carnuntum, a circle of men crystallized who embodied, in their own way, Rome's response to the crisis. They were not the descendants of the Scipios or the Caesars, nor the typical salon aristocrats. They were generals forged by the frontier, whose careers reveal the ruthlessly meritocratic face the empire could take when survival was at stake. The philosopher prince, who in the Meditations reflected on the fleeting nature of glory, knew that to save that ephemeral world he needed executors of iron concreteness. His right-hand man, the material architect of the reconquest, was Tiberius Claudius Pompeianus, a Syrian from Antioch, an Oriental. His rise was not linked to blue blood, but to military talent and, not secondarily, to the fact of having become the emperor's son-in-law, having married his daughter Lucilla, the young widow of Lucius Verus. Pompeiano was the tactician, the man who spent his days studying patrol reports, calculating march times, planning the siege of the next outpost to be reconquered. His presence guaranteed that Marcus Aurelius' strategic will was translated into precise orders, correct deployments and coordinated assaults. He was the professional of war who supported the philosopher of necessity. The tireless figure of Publio Elvio Pertinus worked alongside him, often in symbiosis. His story was even more emblematic. The son of a freedman, a man of very humble origins who had begun his career as commander of a cohort in Syria, had risen through pure merit, recognized by Marcus Aurelius himself for his competence and courage. Pertinax was the man to send to the most critical sector, where the lines were thin and the enemy pressed harder. He did not have the charisma of the aristocracy, but he possessed the clear and tempered authority of someone who knew the craft of war from below, from the dust of the field. His task in those phases, perhaps as commander of a vexillatio or a sector of the front, was to hold, to resist, to consolidate a key point reconquered at great cost. In him, the empire demonstrated that it could draw strength even from the deepest layers of its society, as long as they were strong. And then there were the specialists. Like Marco Valerio Maximiano, former prefect of the powerful classis Pannonica. His was not the frontal glory of the infantry commander. His war was made up of vats of wheat unloaded with precision, of pontoons lined up for a night crossing, of river reconnaissance to locate the barbarian camps along the banks. His fleet was the artery without which the body of the Roman army would have gone gangrenous. Logistics, in that hostile environment, was both tactics and strategy. Another, whose name unfortunately history has not preserved with certainty, was the prefect of the Mauritanian cavalry. These North African horsemen, accustomed to the desert sands, were now a very valuable resource on the Danubian plains. Light, fast, masters of throwing the javelin from the saddle, they were the only ones who could stand up to the comparison with the Sarmatian knights in agility and mobility. They were used as scouts, as a screen for infantry, as a shock force to hit enemy flanks. This general staff, so composite, functioned under a unifying principle, the direct, personal trust of the emperor. Marcus Aurelius governed this war council with the same stoic ethics that he applied to himself. He required obedience, but listened to technical advice. It promoted merit, even if inconvenient for the traditional social hierarchy. The discipline he imposed was not that of terror, but that of common responsibility. It is said that during those months, a young tribune, out of excess of zeal or cowardice, had ordered a premature retreat during a minor clash, causing the loss of an outpost. The fact was brought to the attention of the emperor. An exemplary sentence was expected. Marcus Aurelius, however, summoned the officer. He didn't scream, he didn't threaten. He explained to him, with implacable calm, how that small piece of lost land now forced hundreds of men to risk their lives to reconquer it. He made him see firsthand the weight of the chain of command, where each link had to hold. The officer, it is said, emerged from the tent not humiliated, but transformed, with an understanding of war deeper than any corporal punishment. This was the climate, a granite seriousness, a sense of shared mission. Luxury was banned, rations were Spartan, the emperor himself's sleep was short and interrupted by messengers. In Carnuntum, that winter, a war was being fought even before meeting the enemy in the open field. The war against disorder, disorganization, discouragement. And Marcus Aurelius' generals were his lieutenants in this invisible but decisive battle. Their strength did not lie in their heroic aura, but in being perfectly suited to the task of rebuilding, piece by piece, the wall that had collapsed. As the snows melted in the Carpathians, the great Danube river awoke, swollen with cold, turbid waters. That spring flood was not just a natural event. For the Romans it became a strategic tool, a liquid barrier that temporarily isolated the barbarian bands remaining south of the shore, cutting them off from reinforcements and supplies from their homeland. It was time to move from reconstruction to action. The objective for the spring of 171 was clear, brutal, and limited: to clean, inch by inch, the Roman bank of the Danube. Eliminate any enemy presence south of the large river, restore visual and control contact on the bank. It was not yet a question of in-depth punitive campaigns, but of localized surgery to close the open wound. The ensuing campaign was a war of small units, a conflict made up of clashes that would never have deserved a triumphal column in Rome, but which were the true foundation of the recovery. It was not the legions in tight formation that moved, but the numbers of auxiliaries, the mixed cohorts of infantry and cavalry, the vexellations of legionaries detached for specific tasks. These agile units, often commanded by veteran centurions or prefects of equestrian rank, operated like precise blades. Their mission: to reconquer the nodal points of the territory. A strategically important ford, where the barbarians had established an illegal market and crossing point, a hill overlooking a bend in the river, used as an observation post, an abandoned Pannonian village occupied as a winter refuge. The actions were rapid, often at night. The fleet transported a handful of men to the enemy shore upstream from the objective. Moving through woods and marshy terrain, the Romans attempted to catch the occupiers by surprise. There was no room for major maneuvers. It was the war of the knife and the dagger, of the sudden cry in the silence of dawn, of the hand-to-hand clash between the palisades of a village. Reconquering a burgess, a small stone and wood guard fort that had fallen the previous year, might require a full-scale siege, with ladders and improvised battering rams. The barbarians, caught inside, fought with the desperation of those who know they have no escape route. But Roman discipline, the ability to rotate fresh men to the fighting line, ultimately prevailed. Often, upon the arrival of Roman reinforcements by river, the barbarian survivors attempted a disorderly escape, only to be intercepted by the Mauritanian cavalry deployed to cut off the retreat. The true symbol of this phase, however, was the reoccupation of the strong major legionaries. Not all had been taken, but some, isolated and overwhelmed in the chaos of 170, were still in enemy hands. Besieging them was no task for small units. It required the deployment of a portion of the newly reconstituted legionary force. Marching on one of these forts, seeing one's insignia still hanging above the walls, but defended by foreign faces, must have been a searing experience for a legionary. The siege that followed was methodical, relentless. Ring trenches were dug to isolate the fortress, embankments were built to bring the siege towers into contact with the walls. The barbarians within, often mixed tribes without a single command, lacked the discipline to resist a professional war machine for long. The capture of one of these forts was more than a military victory, it was an exorcism. The moment in which the legionary eagle was hoisted again on the main tower marked the restoration of order in that precise point of space and of the Roman mind. It was tangible proof that the regression towards chaos could be reversed. These actions, taken individually, may have seemed marginal. But like the pieces of a mosaic, once placed together, they recomposed the picture of the border. Every ford retaken, every fort reoccupied, every village liberated, tightened its grip around the isolated barbarian bands south of the river. Deprived of points of support, observation and supplies, they found themselves increasingly hunted, forced to gather in larger groups to survive, thus becoming more visible and vulnerable targets for the next phase. The spring of 171 did not see a single major battle. He saw hundreds of small flashes of violence, of painful sighs of relief, of flags flying again over abandoned guard posts. It was the patient, obstinate phase of cleaning up the pitch. Before it could challenge the king of the Marcomanni in his kingdom, Rome had to reclaim its home threshold. And every centurion who planted the signum of his century again on a reconquered hill was hammering the first nail to rebuild the world. The consolidation of the Roman shore was the necessary prelude to the main score. With the Danube once again a safe barrier behind it, the Roman army was finally able to turn its gaze, and the tips of its spears, northwards, towards the barbarian shore where the main forces of the Marcomanni and Quadi were presumably reorganizing, perhaps in disbelief at the speed of the Roman reaction. The summer of 171 was to produce a decisive clash, a pitched battle that would establish, once and for all in the season, who dominated the field. The sources, lacking in details for this specific year, reveal through honorary inscriptions and subsequent references the skeleton of a great clash, probably fought in Quado or Marcomanno territory, immediately across the river. The barbarian strategy, perfected in the disaster of the previous year, was simple and lethal. Lure the compact Roman infantry into an apparently open area, and then envelop it with the deadly mobility of the Sarmatian cavalry, whose impact with a two-handed spear could break any formation. It was the steppe tactic applied to the Danube forests. Marcus Aurelius and his generals, aware of the danger, did not march in a compact and vulnerable formation. The army advanced as a multiple organism. The legionary and auxiliary infantry constituted the heavy, beating heart, but massive detachments of cavalry operated on the flanks and in advance. Not only the fast Mauri, but perhaps heavy knights cataphractarii, also of oriental origin, and above all, units of light infantry and slingers, deployed to disturb and disorganize the enemy charges before impact. The clash, when it occurred, was not the sudden meeting of two armies. It was the culmination of days of maneuvers, skirmishes, attempts to outflank. The Romans chose the terrain carefully, possibly anchoring one side to a natural obstacle, a small river, a swamp, an impenetrable forest, to protect themselves from total encirclement. The infantry lined up in multiple lines, with reserves ready to intervene where the pressure became unbearable. And when the Sarmatian cavalry launched their epic charge, the Roman shield wall closed. The front ranks, the hastati, planted their long pila on the ground like an inclined iron forest, while from the rear came a continuous hail of sling bolts and arrows. The impact was terrible, a din of breaking wood, metal against metal, shouts of men and neighing of horses. The Sarmatian knights, accustomed to overwhelming and dispersing, found themselves bogged down against a barrier that would not yield. It was in this moment of paroxysmal tension, while the Roman center held up but struggled under the pressure, that the gesture that Roman military anecdotes were so fond of took place. Perhaps it was a centurion of the front line, seeing the signifer of his cohort fall pierced, who grabbed the banner dripping with blood before it hit the ground. Or perhaps it was a surrounded standard-bearer of an auxiliary vexillatio who planted his banner in the dying ground, becoming a point of reference around which the survivors rallied in a last, desperate island of resistance. These individual acts did not change the tactical fate of the clash, but they embodied the spirit that was changing them. The abstraction of discipline transformed into flesh, bones, and iron will. It was the moment when the military mechanism demonstrated that it had a soul. The strategic turning point, however, was the work of the Roman command. Pompeianus or Pertinax, or perhaps Marcus Aurelius himself from the commanding position, held back the Roman cavalry until the critical moment. They did not launch a premature countercharge. They waited until the mass of the barbarian cavalry was fully engaged against the Roman center, the horses tired, the lances broken. Then, given the signal, the Roman and allied cavalry wings were unleashed. They did not charge the group head-on, but targeted the flanks and especially the rear of the enemy formation, where the reserves and commanders were located. It was a hammer blow on the flank of the barbarian army. The Sarmatian cavalry, trapped between the rock of the Roman infantry and the hammer of the Roman cavalry, lost cohesion. The order shattered into myriad individual acts of survival. The retreat became broken. The consequences were immediate and profound. The battlefield remained in Roman hands, with an immense loot of weapons, horses and, above all, Roman prisoners captured the previous year and freed. But the most important effect was psychological and political. The aura of invincibility that the tribes had achieved in 170 dissolved. The coalition, held together by the prospect of easy prey, showed its first deep cracks. The Quadi, perhaps less involved or more affected by the conflict, began to evaluate options other than total war. For Rome, that victory did not mean the end of the war. The Marcomanni were still very strong in their lands, but it meant that the initiative had passed firmly into their hands. The army had demonstrated that it could not only resist, but win in the open field, on the terrain chosen by the enemy. It was proof that Roman organization, discipline, and military technology, when well commanded, could break even the wildest fury. The road to the Bohemian mountains was still long, but it was now passable. The field victory of 171 was not the signal for a ruthless in-depth invasion. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher general, demonstrated here an understanding of war that went beyond mere annihilation. He had broken the backbone of the barbarian coalition in battle. Now he was preparing to shatter the individual vertebrae with the weapon of diplomacy. The sword remained unsheathed, but the hand holding it was now ready to reach out, selectively, towards some of the vanquished. The objective was clear: break the union between Marcomanni and Quadi, isolate the main enemy and restore, at least partially, the old border patronage system. The negotiations did not take place in palaces, but on the plains still steaming from battle or in the newly re-established Roman outposts. Messengers began to travel between the imperial camp and the Quadi villages. The Roman argument was simple, and therefore effective. They had just suffered a severe defeat. The Marcomanni, who had pushed them to war, had failed to protect them. Rome, however, was demonstrably stronger than the year before. The choice was between the continuation of a conflict that would only lead to the devastation of their lands and their people, and a return to a controlled but advantageous relationship with the empire. The price of peace for the Quadi was high, but concrete. They had to return all the Roman prisoners still in their possession, cease all hostility, and probably provide contingents of auxiliaries to the imperial army as a guarantee of their loyalty. In exchange, Rome would suspend military operations against them, perhaps allow controlled access to border markets, mercatus, and recognize their autonomy under a favorable king. This process of separating the Quadi from the war was a masterly maneuver. It deprived the Marcomanni of a crucial ally, both in terms of men and territory for maneuver. But Marcus Aurelius wanted the message to be clear for everyone. While negotiations were held with some Quadi leaders, with others an iron fist was used. Barbarian commanders who stood out for particular ferocity or treachery, perhaps those responsible for massacres of civilians or the killing of captured Roman officers, were treated exemplary. Sources hint at public executions. They were not cruelties for cruelty's sake, but calculated acts of political theater. They demonstrated to the tribes that Rome distinguished between the enemy who could be reintegrated into the system and the irrecoverable enemy, who had to be eliminated physically and symbolically. It was the classic dialectic of Roman power: terrible punishment for the rebels, calculated clemency for the subjugated. At the same time, the Roman military machine did not stop. Indeed, the de facto truce with the Quadi allowed every resource, every legion, every knight to be concentrated on the real objective, the heart of Marcomann power. The Roman armies, now without the fear of being flanked by Quadra raids, were able to push more boldly towards the territories of the Marcomanni, in the region of present-day Bohemia. Operations became more targeted, more punitive. It was a question of attacking villages, sanctuaries, centers of power, of demonstrating that the protection of forests and mountains was no longer sufficient. The emperor himself, it is said, oversaw the construction of a new fortified camp advanced into enemy territory, a sign of permanent presence and domination. This hybrid phase, made up of negotiations on one border and military incursions on the other, reveals the dual nature of Marcus Aurelius as commander. He was a Stoic, and therefore a realist. He understood that the extermination of entire populations was impossible and counterproductive. The border, one day, was supposed to be re-established, and with it a form of coexistence. But he was also the Pontifex Maximus, the guarantor of state security. The Marcomanni, as a political entity that had dared to threaten Italy itself, could not simply be welcomed back with a treaty. They had to be bent, humiliated, reduced to a state of such weakness that they would no longer pose a threat for a generation. Diplomacy with the Quadi was not a sign of weakness, but the necessary preliminary to a more concentrated and ruthless war of annihilation. While the Quadi leaders handed over the Roman prisoners into the hands of the quaestor officials, to the west the roar of the sieges and the clang of weapons announced that for the Marcomanni there was, in that year, no room for negotiations. Only unconditional submission or escape deeper into their forests. The year 171 thus ended with a completely overturned strategic landscape. A permanent fracture had been opened in the barbarian coalition, and Rome could now concentrate its wrath, methodical and organized, on the true author of the storm. While the treaties were being signed and the marching columns were moving towards the Marcomanni woods, another war, silent and equally decisive, was being fought close to the Danube. The victory in the open field and the diplomatic disintegration of the enemy would have been ephemeral if they had not been rooted in an impregnable material reality. Marcus Aurelius's grand strategy ultimately rested on the ability to feed, equip, and move tens of thousands of men in a semi-depopulated and recently devastated region. The real miracle of 171 was not only the battle won, but the daily bread guaranteed to the frontier soldier. Grain was the emperor's logistical obsession. The fertile plains of Pannonia and Moesia, normally the breadbasket of the front, had been plundered. The crops of 170 had been lost or plundered. Resupply became a large-scale operation drawing from unimaginable distances. Cargo ships loaded with Egyptian and African cereals sailed up the Adriatic to the mouth of the Danube, where the cargo was transshipped onto the more agile Liburnians of the classis Moesica. The river turned into a conveyor belt hundreds of miles long. At Carnuntum, at Brigesio, at Aquincum, huge horrea arose or were strengthened, fortified warehouses guarded like fortresses. Inside, an army of military bakers, pistors, worked night and day, stoking ovens that were supposed to produce each man's standard ration of bread, an ancient assembly line whose end product was the legionary's physical strength. Alongside bread, there was the need for wood. The forests along the river provided the raw material for the total reconstruction of the defense system. The blacksmiths, the legionary engineers, became the great architects of that spring and summer. Not only were the damaged forts repaired, new ones were built, smaller, more numerous, according to a principle of defense in depth. These burgi and presidia, placed within visual distance of each other, formed a network of territorial control that made it impossible for enemy gangs to infiltrate without being spotted. The technique was quick and effective: a solid wooden palisade, an internal embankment, an external ditch, corner towers for sighting. Each fort, manned by a century or a numerous of auxiliaries, was a node in a nervous network leading back to Carnuntum. But the real pharaonic work was the bridge. To ensure the continuous flow of men and supplies between the two banks, essential for offensive operations, a pontoon bridge was built over the Danube, probably near the imperial headquarters. A work of hydraulic and military engineering. Boats anchored firmly, covered by a plank that formed the roadway, protected by river towers and fences. That bridge was the physical symbol of the Roman reconquest, not a temporary crossing for a raid, but a permanent structure that projected Rome's power onto the barbarian bank, transforming the river from a barrier into a communication route. Around these outposts, as a vital side effect, life flourished again. The Canabi, the civilian settlements that sprang up outside the forts, began to pulse again. Merchants, often veterans or their relatives, reopened the tabernae, offering wine, fabrics and metal objects to the soldiers who received their salaries. Small markets arose at agreed-upon points, where under the surveillance of Roman sentries, farmers from subjugated or pacified tribes could exchange grain, furs, or livestock for Roman coins or manufactured goods. It was the first, fragile retying of the threads of the economy and controlled coexistence. In these scenes of normal administration of the frontier lay the essence of the Roman project. Not the desert after the war, but the order that follows it, made up of weights and measures, of recorded transactions, of a summary but present justice. In the pauses of this titanic organizational work, Marcus Aurelius found time for his correspondence. His letters to his trusted master Fronto in Rome do not speak of military glories, but of fatigue, of the cold, of melancholy. He also wrote to the Senate, dry reports that masked the enormous effort made under an official tone. But it was the communications with his prefects and procurators that revealed the man of government. Precise requests on the quality of the iron for the nails, the quantity of leather for the shields, the health of the draft horses. On those nights on the Danube, the philosopher-emperor perhaps meditated on the impermanence of things, but at dawn he signed orders to guarantee that those same things, the walls, the bridges, the bags of grain, were solid, durable, and capable of resisting the winter and the enemy. His greatest war, that year, was perhaps this, transforming chaos into administrative order, destruction into methodical construction. Every brick of the new Burgos, every measure of grain in the Horea, was a defeat inflicted on the entropy that had threatened to overwhelm the empire. The winter of 171-172 AD announced itself as bitterly cold, but the frost that fell on the Danube found a landscape profoundly changed compared to 12 months earlier. The great river, bloodline and passageway in the year of fear, had been returned to the empire. The wound had been stitched. Along the entire bank, from Rhaetia to Messia, the Roman sentries returned to scrutinize the northern banks from rebuilt towers, their breath condensing in the cold air, marking a border that had once again become clear, physical, manned. The primary mission of the year had been accomplished. Roman forces were no longer camped just south of the river. The most significant strategic novelty were the advanced outposts, the têtes de pont firmly established on the left bank, in the midst of barbarian land. They were not simply entrenched camps for a season, but permanent fortifications of wood and earth, designed to resist winter and the enemy. These garrisons, often located on dominant heights or guarding important natural penetration routes, had a dual function, acting as starting points for future campaigns in the coming year, and constituting an early warning system, a safety belt that distanced the threat from the river itself. It was the frontier that advanced, by a few miles but with an immense significance. Rome did not simply push back, but strategically reoccupied the territory. The army itself was an unrecognizable organism compared to the disbanded mass of 170. The legions, reinforced by the vexallations arrived from all over the empire and integrated by new recruits, had found their backbone. The chain of command, welded by the trial of fire and by Marcus Aurelius' personal trust in men like Pompeianus and Pertinax, operated with ruthless efficiency. Logistics, that monstrous apparatus of granaries, mills, river ports and workshops, was now a tested machine, capable of supporting a prolonged effort. But above all, perception had changed. The ghost of barbarian invincibility had been dissolved in the plain of pitched battle. The legionary who stood guard over a new fort knew he had already defeated the Sarmatian cavalry and Marcomanni infantry in the open field. He no longer looked at the river with terror, but with the security of the owner. Fear had migrated north, into the forests where tribes wondered how to resist a power that, once awakened, seemed unstoppable in its methodical determination. The fragmentation of the coalition was the second, enormous political success. The Quadi, formerly no longer at war, were an ambiguous but neutralized presence. The Romans held hostages, controlled access to markets, and could turn against them at any time. The Marcomanni, the hard core of the resistance, now found themselves isolated. The Roman military pressure against them had not ceased with the winter, but had transformed into a war of attrition made up of punitive incursions, destruction of crops and economic blockades. The Limes was no longer a line to defend, but a base from which to start. The year 171 AD did not end the Marcomannic War. He did not see the capture of an enemy king, nor the sack of a barbarian capital. Yet, it was undoubtedly the decisive year, the turning point from which there would be no return. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher forced to be a warrior, had accomplished the most difficult feat for a commander, stopping a rout, reassembling a defeated army and reconverting it, in the space of a single season, into a victorious offensive instrument. His greatness in that year was not that of the tactical genius in the field, although the great battle bears witness to this, but that of the supreme administrator, the tireless logistician, the politician capable of dividing enemies with words and fear. He spent the winter governing the panic, and the summer orchestrating the rebirth. The Danube had been reconquered, not only militarily, but as an idea. The border had been restored as a concept of Roman world order. However, The philosopher-soldier knew that lasting peace could not be built on defense alone. The storm had been pushed back across the river, but the clouds continued to gather over the mountains of Bohemia. 171 was the year of the desperate hold and reconquest. He had returned the initiative and trust to Rome. Now, with the river safe behind us and the army reinvigorated, the possibility arose of transforming that defense into a decisive and definitive offensive. But planning that next move, the transition from recovery to solution, would be the task of the new year, which opened cold and uncertain beyond the left bank of the great river.